I have joining me Ralph Obasoje, who's a public affairs analyst and international affairs enthusiast who joins us virtually from Lekki here in Lagos. Ralph, thank you for joining me on the program. I mean, these are, good morning, and these are really heartbreaking stories, from Ukraine. The woman who's lost everything, lost her house, lost her husband, and she's all alone and still really trying to rebuild. Sort of makes you think how resilient human beings are, right?
Exactly, especially when I think she still hopes that she will find her daughter. And that is what the human DNA is. I mean, I think she will be able to have some kind of temporary relief if she can find the daughter. And we all pray for her. Our prayers are with her for now, at this moment, to ensure that the daughter is still safe.
Well, I don't know about finding her daughter, but I think she's also trying to rebuild her home as well. I know that is the difficult part, isn't it, of this war, trying to rebuild what you once knew to be your life after the war. When you think about it, if you, I honestly don't know how old you are, but if you probably had to think about back to a time when you had to experience, any crisis at all, what do you think really is most important to people after, a situation like this? What is most important to them? Is it finding loved ones, or is it trying to rebuild a life they once had?
It's everything put together. It's a potpourri. Amarachi, I was very active as a child during the Nigerian Civil War because soldiers took over our compound. We were somewhere in the Eastern Land, in Edo State, where my dad was heading P&T office then. And I knew what it was because we knew what we saw. People that were running back to their Igbos that were running back to their territory, many of them were intercepted. And as a child, even though they were not shot at my presence, I saw them. Back to the main issue of the question, everything that people need to rebuild their lives is a totality of everything they can get. The sense of community. This is when society, whether immediate community, international community, this is when they come to their aid. Finding their loved ones is one part of it that can psychologically restore their mental state, their emotional state, and then trying to recover lost property is also very key. And more importantly, their humanity, making sure that they can pick up the pieces again and live again is very important. And there are mechanisms, international mechanisms to help people do this, actually owned and anchored by the United Nations and other regional bodies and countries. The EU also have funds for such interventions. Everybody, both individuals, organizations, and the international community have roles to play. Even the family units, even if anybody that can help, they all have roles to play to help people to recover and come back to what gives them hope to live again.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, these high-profile visits that have been occurring, in Ukraine. We've seen them over the past few weeks. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was there visiting President Volodymyr Zelensky a couple of weeks ago. And then, last week it was the turn of the US the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and then the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. And then over the weekend, it was the U.S. House Speaker who led a group of Democrats, to Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, apart from the psychological benefits, that this has as a moral booster for the Ukrainian president, what other benefits are there, for these high-profile visits, especially in a time of war?
I am one of those that worry about those visits because as you have just shown, even the First Lady is in the region doing the same thing. The First Lady, the U.S. First Lady. Yeah. Some of these visits, we want to ask, what are the purposes? Because as you have already heard, you will find that the U.S. Congress is trying to pass a vote for 33 billion naira to give military
dollars.
aid.
$3 billion, you mean?
Yes, dollars, yes, to give military aid to. Germany is sending about 120 Panzer heavy tanks. And when they do this, they are only exacerbating the war. I would have thought that these American leaders should have been gearing their efforts towards a ceasefire and resolving the peace. You know, if they had all visited Russia to say, hey, Putin, we may have anointed you as NATO, or as the US, but please, ceasefire, we will support you this time, there will be less suffering on the Ukrainian people. But instead, they are pumping weapons into Ukraine. They are fueling the war. And like I have a secondary school platform where all the American colleagues, those of my classmates who are in the US, who are now American citizens, are actually fighting some of us to say we are Russians because of our views. We want a free world. We want a world that is at peace. Okay? Now, you ask yourself in Ukraine, for instance, why is America pumping so much money into giving military hardware instead of putting energy to having a ceasefire and letting the people live? Joe Biden's son is the biggest weapons contractor in Ukraine. You know, during the Trump era, Trump was trying to probe him for selling weapons illegally to Ukraine. And these are some of the things that angered Putin, and they are still fueling it. What is the use of that? So I think we should be able to call out the West and NATO to also say they should check themselves. We are not saying Russia is right. Okay? The hardship and sufferings that have been visited on the people of Ukraine is unwarranted. You know, unfortunately, in all this, African Union has been silent. We know where their heart is. But in terms of public advocacy, one would have expected that the AU Secretariat should have also made the kind of statements that the Organization of American States has made, like the EU has made. The EU is pro America, and they've all taken a common stand. So we all need to bring all this to say, I don't see the usefulness of the visits. The usefulness, the visits, like if you listen to the US Defense Secretary when he visited, he said the aim is to actually weaken Russia, that the war must continue. Zelensky should not talk peace. He should fight on. That is not the kind of thing that we want to hear. For those of us who love world peace, who travel a lot, we don't want to be endangered when we go to any place. I frequent the US a lot, and we would have thought that they should have been, for the US to publicly say, oh, the aim of this war is to weaken Russia, it then gives feeling to Russian fears and the apprehension that Putin has had about NATO expansions. So I'm sorry to say, the benefit, I don't really see it to be full, because it's a double-edged sword.
I understand, what you're saying perfectly. I just want to point out a few things. I know with the issue of Joe Biden's son, it's still not proven. I think it's still on investigation. And then what more diplomatic efforts could have taken place to have stopped this war or even intervene? Because, I know the U.S. officials and more European and Western officials have been banned from entering Russia. And then the Russian president already apparently had this plan in place, and it is on course. And President Putin has said, his plan for Ukraine will continue until it is over. He will see through this plan. So what other diplomatic efforts could have been made to have, produced a ceasefire in Ukraine? He didn't even promise the UN Secretary General, who was there last week, exactly, that there will be ceasefire, because he said there are, certain issues that still need to be ironed out. So what other diplomatic efforts could have been made?
Yeah, the UN has become a toothless bulldog, especially since when the world has become a monolithic world. And you look at the invasions in Libya, in Iraq, and the rest. But if you sat there and you saw a weather-beaten man who was not too decisive a Kofi Annan would have made a very strong speech in Moscow to say we need a ceasefire. He would have gone to Kiev to also make the same statement and pressure both presidents to even start talking to one another. Like I alluded to in my earlier speech, if all these high-profile visitors had gone to Moscow to give Putin that sense of belonging, to give the Russians that sense of belonging, perhaps that would have been some start towards peace. And then when they urge everybody, if they can get a ceasefire, which the world can do, if the EU becomes less hostile to Russia, there will be sanctions that they have done. It's already hurting all economies. There's shortage of wheat all over the world. And I understand that the American economy has shrunken by 1.3% as at last month. These are all the effects of it, because the sanction is not even hurting them back. They should direct that effort towards trying to call for a truce and actually trying to assuage the fears of Russia, and also then putting that 33 billion into reconstruction of Ukraine will go a long way. $33 billion into the rehabilitation of the broken-hearted people who had suffered the impact of this war would have gone a long way. Well, supply more weapons. But you are aware that if there is no war, if America doesn't fight any war and supply weapons, the weapons industry in the US will suffer. That is all there is to this game, you know? So the world needs to step up. The UN needs to step up, because the UN is the one that has these tools to be able to persuade world leaders, whether African leaders, European leaders, American leaders, to try and push for true peace so that the Ukrainians can have their lives back again.
Yeah, I just want to point out as well, the US is not the only weapons maker in the world. So there are, if you're talking about those who are benefiting from this war, there are many of them. You spoke earlier about, the AU intervention. You said, because you understand where the AU's loyalties lie. What exactly could the AU have done, in this circumstance?
Okay, to show you the importance of America as a continent, we have resources. But you can see Zelensky for the third time begging to actually address the AU leaders. AU leaders have not acceded to that. He has addressed the OAS leaders, he has addressed European leaders, but the AU leaders have not agreed. And that is to show you, and it's because of the antecedents, because Russia is a friend of the downtrodden countries in the world. You can't forget about the liberation movements in Africa. Half of Africa became independent because when they were undergoing all the excruciating pressure of imperialism and colonialism, it was Russia that gave aid and military aid and financial aid to get these countries liberated. Mozambique, Angola, South Africa. You heard Nelson Mandela, the sage, say, sorry, we can never be enemies to Russia. He told the US. So when you now find countries that have that kind of history, they can't forget so soon. Zambia cannot forget, all right? And that is where the feeling of Africa is coming from. Half of the African leaders cannot forget how they became free as nations. And that is why you can see that AU did not condemn the invasion. And that is why, up to now, with the US even pressing and lobbying African leaders, which I am aware of because I work for an international organization, they've not been able to convince the AU Secretariat to set up a meeting with African leaders, because it is all just hypocrisy. So that is where the heart of Africa lies. But could Africa have kept silent like this? No. If you look at the votes at the UN High Commission for Refugees and the rest,
yeah.
you will find that, yes, you will find that most African countries either voted no or abstained from voting. That drives home the position of Africa. But I would have expected the AU Commission, to come out and state equivocally where we are. We should have pushed for peace. We should have added our voice. And that may have also pushed the powerful countries to turn to a different line towards finding peace.
Yeah, and I think the AU did, just as we said, they did, put out a statement calling for all parties to cease fire. Of course, Ralph Obasanjo, thank you again for speaking with me. I know it's pretty early. It's also a holiday, so lots of people are at home today. Thanks again for joining me on the program.
Thank you very much, Amarati. Do have a nice day.
You too.